So people are entering the room. Welcome everybody to Silver Hill Grand Rounds program. We'll get started in just a moment, but that's where you are. All right, I will go ahead and get started. Um, Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for being here. I'm Dr. Jeff Katzman. I'm the Director of Education here at Silver Hill Hospital and Director of our what we call the SHARE program, the Silver Hill Academy for Research and Education that sponsors this Grand Rounds program. And we are delighted to have you join us today and privileged really to welcome two very distinguished guests, Dr. Karen Gilmore and Pamela Meersand from Columbia University, who will be presenting on the topic of emerging adulthood, the new developmental phase of the 21st century. First, a little bit of housekeeping to start us off. As always, our next Grand Rounds takes place on October 22nd with Dr. Christine Yu Motier, Chief Medical Officer of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. And she will talk to us on the topic of caring for our own and reducing suicide risk and enhancing mental health. In January, I want to put a plug out that we will be hosting and soon sending out to everybody on our listserv a 30-week course that we're calling Introduction to Psychodynamics. That will be a 30-week virtual course. We'll have an open house on October 30th where people can learn more about this, but it will be a virtual program once a week for an hour with an opportunity to form chat group communities for people to learn about theoretical and evidence-based models within psychodynamic thinking. Also, if you are local to Connecticut or want to fly in, please join us on Friday, November 7th, when Dr. Ben Bernstein and I will be presenting an in-person training based on using improvisational theater techniques for psychotherapists to develop curiosity and presence and familiarity with working with the unknown, which is what we often do as therapists. And we have a lot of fun in these programs, and it's a really good way to develop those skills. So hopefully people are curious and can join us. I think there was even a picture in our waiting room of maybe of Ben and myself in some programs that we've done before. So to learn about all of our Silver Hill Share events, please visit us at silverhillhospital.org/calendar. Back to today's lecture. Your questions remain an important part of our grand rounds, and I will moderate a Q&A discussion with Doctors Gilmore and Meersand at the end of their lecture. This is a great opportunity to put forward questions and comments to them, which you can submit anytime during the lecture by using the Q&A link. Please do not use the raise hand function. If you would like CME or CEU credits today, please complete the evaluation survey that will pop up in your browser when we end the webinar. A link to the survey will also be emailed to all participants tomorrow. This will be a Zoom email coming from SHH Events and will contain a link to the recording and slide presentation. The survey will remain open until the end of day on Friday, and certificates will be emailed within a week. Please note that while doctors may receive partial credits based on the length of their participation, all other attendees must participate for the full 90 minutes in order to receive credits or certificates. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact us at shhevents@silverhillhospital.org. Finally, disclosures: no planners of this activity have indicated a relevant financial relationship with an ACCME defined commercial interest, and Doctors Gilmore and Meersand will show a slide with their disclosures. With that, it is now really a great pleasure and honor to introduce our guest speakers today, Dr. Karen Gilmore and Dr. Pamela Meersand. Dr. Karen Gilmore is clinical professor of psychiatry at Columbia University and WCM NYPH and senior consultant to the Columbia University Center for Psychoanalytic Training and Research. She has co-authored 4 books on normal development, play therapy, and emerging adulthood with Pamela Meersand. She has published a number of papers on development, play, ADHD, and emerging adulthood. Dr. Gilmore is in private practice in Manhattan. Dr. Pamela Meersand is the director of the Child Division at the Columbia Center for Psychoanalytic Training and Research and an associate professor of psychology at Columbia's Department of Psychiatry. She is a child and adult training analyst and maintains a private practice in New York City. Her publications have focused on child, adolescent, and emerging adult development and on psychoanalytic training, theory, and technique. All right, so thank you both for being here. If you want to, um, Dr. Gilmore, go ahead and share your slides and make sure we're good to go.
Um, the green at the bottom. Oh, right. Green metal. Okay. And then one down. Yeah. Okay.
Fantastic.
Okay.
It's beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you again to both of you for being here. And again, to our audience, any questions, please put those in the Q&A function, and we'll get to those in a little fireside chat at the end. Great to be with you, and I'm right here.
Okay. So thank you very much for that introduction. We are, as you know, talking about emerging adulthood. I put the 2.0 afterward because it's a new iteration of emerging adulthood. The original population that was described was millennials, and today it's Gen Z. And I think it makes a difference. So I'm going to touch on that point as we go through. Jeffrey Arnett proposed the idea of emerging adulthood to name the interlude between adolescence and adulthood, which seemed to be elongated in his observations. He originally was looking at college students, but over time, the group was extended to include the whole third decade and increasingly incorporated into developmental thinking. In this presentation, we're going to describe the observations that led to his proposal, discuss its doubters, and elucidate its features. We will address the durability of his ideas as a new generation moves into the emerging adult years. Does his original presentation hold up now that millennials have aged out and Gen Zers have moved into this age range? Was he simply describing a generational phenomena, as Jean Twenge suggests? Or is it an enduring addition to the developmental sequence? These are our disclosures, which are not none. And here are the learning objectives that you should be able to do after this conference. You should be able to identify the 5 features of emerging adulthood, to explain the epidemiological shift and the cultural changes that set the stage for this new developmental phase, and to discuss the changing nature of identity development, the role of youth culture, and the new meanings of adulthood in contemporary society. Now I'm going to be quiet and let you read this because I think it's a priceless quote from Freud. In this prescient statement, Freud urges us to be open-minded about transformations taking place in our society, recognizing that we cannot forecast the future. This brief introduction to emerging adulthood is based on the premise that the entire sweep of development is in the process of changing, because development is powerfully shaped by culture. And there is no doubt that our culture has undergone massive transformations in the last 30 years, primarily but not exclusively related to the digital revolution. Oops. I hope you catch this caption here. When I was your age, I was an adult. So in the 19th century, they were children and adults. At the turn of the 20th century, adolescence was discovered, arguably because new child labor laws and mandatory education revealed a complex developmental period. By 1920, teenager was a household word. In his seminal paper of 2000, Arnett identified the new developmental phase of the 21st century, naming it emerging adulthood. His ideas went viral, spawning hundreds of thousands of research studies, its own journal, and its own society. Arnett was suggesting that this was not just a form of transition to adulthood and not just a generational phenomenon, but a substantially new and lengthy interval in which the real work of identity formation and clarifications of the meaning of adulthood occur. He maintains that generational, socioeconomic, racial, and ethnic differences are inevitable, but what is consistent is that in today's world, it takes a long time to recognize oneself and to be recognized as an adult. So this is his original list of developmental challenges for emerging adults: identity role or role exploration, instability, self-focus, feeling in between, and a widening of possibilities, often replaced by talking about optimism. As you can see, some of these features that Arnett identified seem to be extensions of adolescent challenges. As the average age of puberty is a good 2 years earlier than it was half a century ago, and the achievement of adult status is pushed late into the 20s, the search for identity lasts almost 2 decades, from 10 or 11 to 30. This highlights Arnett's core observation: it takes a long time to figure out who you are and what it means to be an adult in this culture. But I think he thinks it's global too. Here are some observations and images about the population we are discussing. Just to remind you, the first cohort called emerging adults were born between 1980 or 81 up to the early 1990s. These were millennials whose older members were not surrounded by devices and electronic media at birth. They were born into the stone age of television. However, in the 90s, even the oldest members of this population became immersed in the digital world with the rise of the internet, proliferation of websites and mobile phones, especially smartphones, which appeared in 1997. While the millennials are sometimes called digital natives, it is really Gen Z, those born around 1995 and beyond. Oh, I understand we have a new generation, Alpha, that's coming up. But it's Gen Z who were born and the first born into a fully mediated world and could not imagine life without devices, screens, and computers. Mobile devices as extensions of their bodies and minds are considered the signature feature of this age group. At this juncture, even generations born before the advent of the World Wide Web and smartphones had been transformed by access to the internet, social media, and the digitized world. Since this discussion inevitably includes references to generations, I want to point out that each generation has defining moments that have set the tone for the transition to adulthood for the entire cohort. Obviously, baby boomers were Second World War was a big thing, and generational theorists identify these for the current, more present 2 generations: 9/11 for the profoundly formative experience of millennials, and COVID-19 as a similarly influential extended moment for Gen Z, the current emerging adult cohort. So for Gen Z, the interruption and suspension of expectable life experiences, such as campus life, actual contact with the peer group, dating, sexual experiences, and valued encounters with older people, such as teachers and coaches, has left an imprint on this generation. Some suggest that the Gen Z stare epitomizes their blighted socialization, their lack of easy small talk, their resistance to demands for constant achievement in the workplace. But these characterizations are not what makes them emerging adults. Whatever the generational idiosyncrasies, the extended interval before reaching adulthood is a consistent finding. So here are some of the detractors' arguments coming from developmental science. Many developmental scientists challenge Arnett's theory from a variety of disciplines. Some developmental scientists want to throw out phases altogether. They consider people much more variable and complex in terms of their developmental process, embracing a dynamic systems conceptualization. Excuse me, some suggest that emerging adulthood will last as long as parents agree to support their grown children. Question is, will it repeat itself? So from sociology, you hear these arguments. It's not a true developmental phase. It's a product of the rapid and radical shift to the techno-informational society and will fade after the transition to a fully mediated world. As a techno-savvy millennials raise their own children and knowledgeably guide them to adulthood, and then Gen Z following. There have been a number of arguments against the legitimacy of emerging adulthood as a developmental phase coming from developmental psychoanalysts. The traditional psychoanalytic formulation of developmental phases was historically based on the presence of biological markers, but this formulation has been challenged repeatedly as it emphasizes biology at the expense of culture. It is increasingly clear that culture is a powerful shaping force in development. The concept of age stages acknowledges the central role of culture in determining developmental categories, since culture sets the expectations, defines the tasks, and establishes standards for successful passage. But some important theorists insist that features of emerging adulthood indicate personality pathology, specifically borderline personality. Dr. Meersand is going to discuss this debate for a moment.
Yes, I'll say a couple of things about detractors from within the psychoanalytic community. I think there are two major groups, one of which can properly be labeled detractors, and the other where I think there's just some difference and tension. But the first group are more traditionally focused psychoanalysts who have some objection to the central role of the social and cultural surround in emerging adult theory. So, those are analysts who, for example, might not look too favorably on people like Erik Erikson, who I'll come back to in a few minutes, who was an analyst, but who also was very interested in anthropology and sociology, and was very focused on the connection between the mind and society. And this same group of more traditional analysts would be more interested in, for example, the consolidation of the superego in late adolescence rather than looking at social experience. I think that group also is less comfortable with the notion of lifespan development, and they tend to follow the more traditional ideas of adolescent development, namely that final forms of the personality were integrated and consolidated in late adolescence, and that anything that happened beyond that, say in the 20s, was not development proper, but was some other kind of process. The other group where there are some interesting differences and tensions is in the community that is very interested in theory about personality disorders. And that includes folks who have followed very closely Otto Kernberg's theory. And some of them are involved in transference-focused psychotherapy, which some of you may be familiar with. And that's an analytically derived form of treatment that uses the transference as a centerpiece and works on the relationship between patient and therapist in the here and now to address deficits in personality. And it's particularly designed for people with borderline pathology. In the last few years, the transference focus group has also developed a new form of treatment for adolescents and young adults called transference focus psychotherapy for adolescents. The training for that is, currently becoming available. And I think there's a lot of overlap there in that they certainly, recognize that there's continued brain maturation through the decade of the 20s, and they're aware of the notion of identity exploration as a developmental task. But they utilize a very rigorous, structured form of assessment that is really designed to reveal aspects of identity diffusion, and that includes some of the things that are up on the screen. So, difficulty with emotional self-regulation, use of action-oriented outlets to manage intense behaviors, instability in the sense of self and other representations. And I think that probably Karen and I would simply take a more cautious approach to diagnosing borderline personality in the emerging adulthood group, simply because there can be a lot of normative instability. There's a great deal of flux and change. And when young people are in the active phase of identity exploration, there can be a lot of action going on. There's a very nice line in a paper by Richard Eichler, who was the head of college counseling at Columbia for a number of years, where he says that you cannot achieve adulthood through contemplation alone, and he talks about the way in which you really have to get out there and test your mettle, and you have to do things out in the world, that it requires action and risk taking. He also says it requires a little bit of, hopeful grandiosity and a touch of magical thinking to think that you can successfully traverse the phase. So I would say between the TFPA group and people who think about this phase in the way that Karen and I do, there's some generative tension and differences, because it helps all of us kind of clarify our thinking.
Okay. Okay, so I mean, of course, this raises the question of what defines adulthood. And in order to put Arnett's research in context, let's look at the traditional sociological definition of adulthood. The achievement of adulthood has for centuries been linked to the societal markers shown here. So I hope you can read that, job, financial independence, possession, home ownership, marriage, and children. Emerging adults see these criteria as lacking any personal significance and in no way corresponding to what they consider adult. These so-called adult markers refer to a 200-year-old and heteronormative white middle-class kind of adulthood. But it was contemplating such markers that Arnett began to see a major shift in the timing of these events. These traditional markers of adulthood are now accomplished much later, and strict adherence to these criteria place the achievement of adulthood late in the 20s, which apparently some Gen Zers agree. 27 is the year, they say. But Arnett kind of dismisses that. In a recent Pew survey, a majority of respondents from 18 middle-income countries, including Argentina, Tunisia, South Africa, saw later marriage and childbearing as preferable. This shift is an important part of Arnett's rationale for emerging adulthood. Moreover, a significant number of 25 to 35-year-olds return to live at home with their families of origin. You can see that it really increased for millennials. As Gen Zers are still returning home, and they're now the dominant group in the emerging adult cohort, the question of whether emerging adult is a millennial phenomenon or a developmental phase, I believe, can be settled. This is just one measure that shows Gen Z's continuation of these trends. One complaint about the early literature was that the population on which Ornette's other groups theory was based, were drawn from college students and could not be generalized to other groups, even within the US. Subsequent research has documented considerable variability among different groups. For example, living at home in one's 20s for minority emerging adults may often be motivated by the need to help and support the family of origin rather than expect to be supported. But nonetheless, these trends are still discernible. Now, what's interesting is the next slide, because this shows one of the pieces of data that Ornette was very interested in, which was the extension of risk behaviors deep into the 20s. In 2000, he identified a number of these risk behaviors that he observed going into the 20s: smoking, drinking, driving while intoxicated, unprotected sex. Note that at that time, binge drinking peaked between 21 and 28. Other risk behaviors, such as overspeed limit driving, also peaked in the 20s. And I'm going to show you another slide, which shows us the changes for Gen Z. I hope you can read this. The trend is, interestingly, mostly going down for the 18 to 34-year-olds in terms of regular drinking and then binge drinking. So this is that measure. And clearly the Gen Zers are much less interested in risk. That's clearly an aspect of them. So here, these are little graphs showing you the changes for drugs, cigarette smoking, drinking a lot, vaping, and so on. So maybe the issue is that risky behavior was really a generational feature of the millennials and not really an aspect of emerging adulthood. That's a possibility. This graphic, which is a medium favored by Gen Z, condenses a lot of the descriptors that are repeated in the literature. So there is there certainly is impatience, but there's definitely an interest in authenticity, in being pragmatic, and being multitaskers, yes, but there's a little bit of the instant gratification that people who develop during the presence of the internet have. But I think these people in this generation feel themselves to be much more environmentally conscious, culturally conscious, and empathic. Yes, or empathetic, as they say. So, and even with those different traits, the Gen Z is taking the same amount of time to feel fully adult. So for millennials, the subjective experience of adulthood is described here. These are the criteria that were endorsed by millennials 20 years ago. Even though more personal and subjective than traditional adult markers, these still sound pretty mainstream. Nonetheless, they are drawn from multiple surveys of diverse populations: white, Latino, African American, Asian Americans, Israeli high school and university students, and Argentinian emerging adults. So this is the change, and I think it is not insignificant, but going in a similar direction. There's a lot more interest in activism and authenticity and a collective. So I think that is a very big difference. So the quote on the top of this slide is from Victoria Flanagan, who is a wonderful critic of young adult fiction. And I recommend her to you if you ever have a chance to read her work. Trying to get back to that. Okay, so I mean, these are kind of astonishing. Oh, sorry, I keep doing that. Astonishing statistics, which I don't know, I'll just leave you to ponder. And even today, as reported by a 2015 Statista survey, 99% of people between 18 and 29 use the internet. All countries surveyed show similar trends. And, these are the usual specifics. Gen Zer uses up to 3 social media platforms a day, and the heavy reliance on smartphones. All teenagers, nearly all, 88% are texters, and multitasking is very common. Which, some people are concerned has an impact on their brain development, but that's the way it is. So for these populations, the virtual and the real are continuous, the virtually actual. As Todd Essick notes, there is no cyberspace. We live in a technologically mediated society. As the third decade of the 21st century is now past its midpoint, it's all the more clear that we occupy an integrated, digitized space where biology and technology are merged, and identity flows between virtual and real life, between self-presentation on the screen and internal self-representation. I don't know if you've ever asked any of your emerging adult patients what their avatar is. It's often fascinating how different it is from what you perceive as their actual person. In our opinion, Arnett recognized an important change in the developmental pathway with immediate implications for adolescent and adult development. While not focusing on adolescence himself, corresponding changes in the earlier phase of adolescent development have also occurred. Of course, the adolescent tasks still concern individuation from family, the emergence and gradual integration into the self-representation of the sexual body and sexual desire, and extensive identity exploration. Adolescence has become a practicing phase, very much like Mahler's practicing subphase of separation individuation, famously described as a love affair with the world. Only as young people move into their mid-20s and stare down the barrel of 30, the weight of decision-making for the rest of one's life begins to transform their gravity, really, and that move them toward a more serious struggle to find oneself. We also believe that part of the challenge for emerging adults and part of why, in our opinion, the shape of adulthood they are heading toward should be viewed as unfolding, as just a glimmering, is that the meaning and complexity of identity in the 21st century has been hugely amplified by cultural changes. We propose that we don't really know which way our 20-somethings are going and what kind of adulthood they will create. Now I'm going to hand the mic, the floor to Dr. Meersand while you sort of contemplate these different factors that are involved in identity.
One of my favorite slides, so thank you. The process of identity development is really at the center of emerging adulthood. the concept. And it's the part of the theory that has really had the most impact on the way that we think about development and treatment in this age group. And there are two main impacts that I'd like to mention. One is that it makes it clear that identity is emerging as a key developmental task of the late teens to the late 20s. And like all other developmental tasks in adolescence or even in earlier childhood, it brings with it its own set of challenges, and it creates its own set of vulnerabilities. And in fact, one of the hypotheses about why this group of young people seems to have such high rates of mental health needs has to do with the possibility that this prolonged period of instability and experimentation and uncertainty sort of opens up vulnerabilities in many individuals. The other main impact is that this theory really emphasizes the importance of the social and cultural surround that young people are exposed to. And in particular, it emphasizes the importance of their active engagement with it, which is important for clinicians to keep in mind. I think it helps balance, keeping an eye on what's going on in the treatment, but also knowing something about what's happening in the young person's outside life, not neglecting that, making sure that they're engaged in some way and functioning as we would hope. So I'm going to briefly take you back to your undergraduate days, appropriate for our topic, because I want to say a little bit about the theory of identity as per Erik Erikson, who has enjoyed quite a revival in the last 20 years or so, and whose theory of identity development is really central to the research on emerging adulthood. So if you took a psychology class or two when you were in college, you probably encountered him. So this may be somewhat familiar or buried somewhere in your memory. But Erikson's main notion was that identity functions at the interface between mental life and social experience, and it's the part of the personality that's responsible for a feeling of, I think he used the word self-sameness, but in other words, continuity, coherence, a feeling that one is recognizable to oneself and to others. And as a psychoanalyst, he was interested in some of the more conscious aspects of identity, which would include domains like beliefs and attitudes and affiliations with certain groups. But he really looked at the way in which those interface with unconscious aspects of identity, that it would include things like modes of being with other people, relational and attachment styles, unconscious fantasies about the self and others, and defensive style. And his notion was that identity is a lifelong process with a high season during late adolescence. And the timing of that probably made sense in the 1950s when he was writing about these things. I mean, we would now say that actually that process continues through the 20s. And he also felt that young people would benefit from the presence of what he called a moratorium, which is basically a time and a setting where youth can experiment freely and engage in self-discovery without having to make permanent commitments of any sort. Just referring back to that Eichler paper that I mentioned a little while ago, Eichler describes this process of using the moratorium and experimentation as the young person auditioning aspects of the self in front of others. And the presence of the social surround, very important to Erikson as well. Part of the process is that you try on identities, and then you get feedback from your peers and from your community. But I think Eichler's use of the word audition and the sort of performative aspect that implies is very apt for the way that this experimentation often takes place in the 21st century, which is through social media and maybe, posting something or putting up a story about, a new relationship or a new group that one has joined or a new way of thinking about politics. And then waiting for the hoped for validation and feedback. And clearly that sort of experimentation in cyberspace opens the young person up to a lot of potential vulnerability because you're reaching potentially a large audience and people are responding on platforms that are, inviting of, less perhaps less restrained comment. So it makes the whole process of identity exploration a little bit bigger, a little bit more stimulating, and a bit more precarious than it might have been in Erikson's day. I also want to mention just a couple of interesting, somewhat more abstract aspects of identity theory. One is that, Erikson talked about this way in which identity performs these sort of dual functions. On the one hand, as it becomes consolidated, it lends the individual a feeling of solidness and stability, continuity, but it also allows for flexibility so that new roles and new ways of thinking can be integrated throughout the lifespan without the individual feeling like they are going to, danger the existing system or that they're going to be derailing. So as one becomes, a partner, a parent, a psychoanalyst, whatever it is, or adopts a new way of thinking about the world, that can be comfortably integrated into the existing system. And the other more abstract part of identity that he talked about that I think is highly relevant for this age group is he discussed the interface of identity development and the capacity for intimacy. The idea being that as one is feeling more certain of oneself, more solid, more consistent, that it actually makes you more available to empathy and intimacy and potentially to commitment because there's less fear that one will lose one's sense of individuality in the presence of the other. There's less worry about being re-infantilized or being taken over, and there's more capacity for mutuality and that kind of empathic resonance. And I think that's interesting to think about in terms of, what we hope to see, in terms of development from, say, late adolescence, when we expect there to be a lot of, sort of transient experimental relationships, to the late 20s when you hope to see a little bit more capacity for concern for the other person, a little more interest in the relationship itself. So in terms of contemporary research, and there's a vast amount of studies on identity, Erikson's theory seems to be borne out in many ways. And some of these studies have clarified and elaborated the process of identity. These studies are largely based on self-reports, and there's a bit of a tilt toward the college age population because the people are a captive audience on a college campus and it's easy to do research there. You can find them. It's a lot harder to try to find 27-year-olds in there, whatever their environments are. But the researchers talk about the process in terms of what they call different statuses. So there's the moratorium status, which is what, Erickson described in terms of like active exploration, experimentation. There's what is called the reconsideration status, which has to do with having received some feedback, maybe some validation, and then just sort of, mulling things over. There are the commitment phases when a particular domain of identity is perhaps selected, although, these are not necessarily linear. And if you commit to an identity domain, that doesn't mean you're going to stay there. And then the research also mentions the foreclosure status, which is meant to describe selecting an identity domain without having really gone through the full process, maybe selecting it too quickly. One of the interesting things that the research has demonstrated is that these different identity factors and domains are not negotiated in tandem. Some come earlier, some come later. There's also been some interesting studies that look at the way in which the process of identity generates its own anxiety that partly has to do with the uncertainty that's involved, the need to manage feedback that isn't always positive, but it also has to do with deeper issues around conflicts between different identity domains or conflicts between some domain that a young person is currently negotiating, but that doesn't go well with the family of origin and the way they were raised. So, common example would be somebody from a somewhat conservative and maybe religious background who is newly engaged at college in negotiating in the area of gender and sexuality. So that can be a rather fraught process as well. And I think, Karen mentioned before the impact of the pandemic. And, if you think about that particular example where, young person is sort of struggling toward self-understanding and self-expression and has identified a community, perhaps on campus where they feel they can freely express themselves, to then, have that completely derailed and have to move back home where that particular identity is maybe not well received or supported, created a great deal of distress for this age group. This notion of normative identity exploration, which can look quite active and at times impulsive and a bit chaotic, is nonetheless distinguished from identity diffusion. Diffusion having much more to do with a painful sense of emptiness and a lack of cohesion. It's often marked by difficulty making emotional commitments to meaningful aspects of identity, by instability in relationships, and by heavy reliance on action-oriented outlets and risky behaviors in order to deal with affective stimulation. And I think, just contemplating the notion of identity exploration as a necessary developmental task, it really makes clear how difficult it is for young people who have mood disorders or are really struggling with addictions. If you're depressed and demotivated, or if you're so anxious that novelty is frightening to you, how difficult it is for those individuals to sort of get involved in the environment and engage in the kind of exploration that is thought to be necessary to traverse this developmental period and to make progress toward greater identity consolidation. Anyway, well, Karen, I'm going to turn back to you to talk about youth culture.
Yes. I mean, certainly some of this experimentation is evident in youth culture. And when I started looking into this topic, it became clear to me that this was a really very important way that emerging adults look to the youth culture as an identity bridge between family life and community life. And it also provides a sense of belonging. And it also gives them a whole language and preferred music and fashion. I mean, it's a wraparound embrace of a new identity. And, actually, many people age in these cultures and become, music producers and things like that. They find their future identity, their work life is going to grow out of these cultures. So this is rap culture, and it is the most long-standing, actually, and continuously evolving, associated with hip hop, breakdancing, graffiti, and fashion. It continues to be the leading musical genre in the US. And here's another. Taylor Swift. She and her Swifties have evolved into their own culture. Despite her evident appeal to young teens and her love of the number 13, 78% of her fandom is between 18 and 34. Indeed, half of the American adults say they are Swift fans. Certainly, there is a range of reliance on that identity, but true Swifties are caught up in friendship bracelets, color-coded Easter egg messages, and rally around the values of authenticity, empowerment, and vulnerability. And if you've ever seen a crowd gathering around where she's giving a concert, you see that it's pretty varied and very large. So extreme sports are another important youth culture, and especially snowboarding and skateboarding. They've achieved massive followings. Like in 2021, skateboarders numbered 8.8 million and snowboarders numbered 7.6 million. There are 6 million indoor rock climbers, and outdoor bouldering is growing in popularity, and it is kind of a lifestyle. Similar to other cultures, dedicated extreme sports enthusiasts share preferences for the same locales, drugs, attire, and music. Many are also known for toxic masculinity, as well as their love of risk and challenge. Today's emerging adults are taking a lead in causes that matter to them. March for Our Lives, which is actually at this point a mature organization, was a protest movement initiated by Parkland High School survivors who mobilized gun control activism, uniting survivors of mass shootings, street violence, and assassinations, and really becoming a political force. Some of the original leaders are quite prominent in trying to influence lawmakers. And then we have Greta and climate activism. And interestingly, here's a picture from Nepal, and this is a mass protest led by Gen Z amid a ban on social media, as well as alleged malpractices and corruption, which led to the resignation of the prime minister. So they can be quite powerful. There's some other examples, but these are people united by causes. And this brief survey of youth cultures, and there are many, many more, only hints at their importance for emerging adult development in terms of the opportunities they provide to find oneself. These, in addition to others like gay youth cultures, cultures associated with musical genres, rave cultures, and so many others, provide an extension of the psychosocial moratorium and a context where identities can be put on, considered, kept selectively, and taken off at will. Emerging adults must be considered in context. Their instability reflects the range of experimentation, shifting passions, and for the millennial cohort, alarming risk behaviors. Many of these can be understood as phase appropriate in terms of the search for identity, for the establishment of reliable and personal values, and for the all-important and self-selected placement of self in the world. Emerging adults do not only manifest narcissistic preoccupation with social media and the accumulation of likes, they also strive to be connected. So this new idea of emerging adulthood has altered the developmental timeline for child and adolescent psychoanalysis and psychiatry, allowing study and integration of a newly extended search for identity. Hopefully, it is doing the same for adult clinicians in their work with young adults, so that they don't necessarily pathologize some of these shifts and turns. And here we have our last slide, which is, I don't know what I want to be. In fact, less than half of college seniors have career plans. They just don't know what they want to be. More accurately stated, they don't want to be any one thing. They want to do what comes next. So thank you for your attention. And now we'll turn it over to question and answer.
Thank you so much for this brilliant presentation. So great to learn from both of you. And to everybody out there, please go ahead and put questions in the Q&A function. Hey, I'll start us off. I'm kind of wondering, given what you're saying, there seems like there's a consolidation of emerging adulthood that happens at a certain point, and then a launch into, I'm assuming, adulthood. And I remember those Ericksonian phases being fairly broad, like 20 years long. And I'm kind of struck lately, perhaps I'm there in older ages, that there's this same question seems to emerge. I don't know what I want to be sometimes after retirement, and people experiment and explore new roles and new friendships. Is it kind of a reemergence of what we had at this time of emerging adulthood, or something different, or how do we understand that?
It's interesting you bring that up, because I think in more recent years, to some extent, Arnett has moved on, from emerging adulthood to, like, I don't know what he's calling the 30s, proper adulthood, young adulthood, something proper. And, I think some of the findings consistent with Erickson's theory are that, there is some manner of identity development, exploration that, continues throughout the lifespan. I think what differentiates this particular decade is the degree of active engagement in the exploration and experimentation, that it's really a centerpiece self-discovery, that it involves bumping up against the culture in a particular way, and that it's being done during a period of time when young people are perhaps not fully equipped to be doing it on their own. So, in the sense that we know the brain continues to mature into the mid-20s, and, just because it's fully mature at, say 25, there's usually still some period of consolidation in development, where you then have to work with your new brain and your newfound impulse control capacities. So I think the vulnerabilities of there still being ongoing development, the new experience of relative autonomy in combination with this very active immersion in the experimentation makes it a little bit different than what comes before or after.
Yeah, I think also, though, that there's an interesting phenomenon among retirees, which I've been observing, that there is a loss of identity. I mean, there is a kind of shock when they feel like they've lost their position. They can't garner the respect because they don't have the title. I think these are difficult moments, and hopefully people begin to find other avenues to feel like accomplished and good about themselves. But it's not easy. It's always a rough patch, I think.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Thank you. So Turning to our questions, we have a question from Bettina Bernstein. Hi, Bettina, who asks right off the bat here, when we started, how do you explain the willingness of youth to accept AI as expert instead of human elders?
Hmm.
Well, I think that I'm going to take a stab at that, and then Pamela, you can have your contribution. But I think that maybe I mean, it's unreasonable to attribute it all to the pandemic, but I think the kids had no one to rely on during that in terms of expertise. They didn't see their teachers, they didn't see their coaches. I mean, I think that the access to adult guidance, which is probably getting better all the time. One of Arnett's ideas is that adults could guide the millennials because they didn't know the first thing about the world they were going into, but now they do. The Gen Zers know what world the kids are going into, so they can be more of a guide. But it's still, I'm not sure how much we can attribute to COVID and its impact on their development, but I certainly think it was extreme. Um, and I mean, maybe it's because it's easy also, but relying on AI. Family, have any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm thinking about the notion from psychodynamic work with this age group of the use of the therapist as a mentor and guide, and the way in which young people in the emerging adulthood cohort are sometimes use the therapist, the therapy itself is like a way station between reliance on familiar parental and teaching figures, having had a pediatrician who knows you all your life, that sort of thing that you lose when you enter the late teens and 20s. And there's often this relationship, this transference that develops toward the therapist that's a little bit idealizing and sees the therapist as, sort of all-knowing and a source of wisdom and wants to be guided. And that's thought to compensate a little bit for the loss of the connection with the parents and for the feeling of just being in between and feeling unstable. And it does make me wonder if, AI in a way presents itself as like a sphinx, with like, all knowing, and whether that, in some way conveys a feeling of security. I'm not thinking so much about people, using it to write their papers and do their homework and that sort of thing, but more just, the idea of this entity uh, probably has some dynamic significance and appeal.
Yeah, great. Another question here. Which themes of emerging adulthood would you think important to consider when working with couples? Any differences between working with couples with millennial members versus couples with Gen Z members?
Well, I think that there may be real divergence in their developmental path, and because divergences are so common now, variations on development. Somebody decides to experiment with Orthodox religion and the partner doesn't go along with it. Then you have this kind of interesting divergence. And I think these couples struggle to resume their equilibrium. That's one thing that I think happens, in this period. Pamela, you have any thoughts?
Yes, I do have a thought, maybe more of an association, and I think it may be more marginally related to the question, but I was thinking of a couple of cases that I've seen where, these are young people in their 20s, and their romantic relationships they're not necessarily committed relationships, but these were kids who were in individual treatment with me, and at some point they wanted to bring in their partner to work on certain issues. And I was just thinking, in general, that we haven't really talked much about treatment with this age group, but that that this is basically a population with very high psychiatric needs, whose retention and treatment tends to be lousy. And when self-reports are, filled out, what the research seems to show in terms of, like what would keep you in treatment. One of the things that comes up at this age group is flexibility, of all sorts, So when this particular patient asked for this, to me, somewhat unusual request, we've been doing an individual treatment, and now I'm gonna bring in this person I've been dating for like 3 months. I assumed that the best stance was to be open to it, and curious about whatever they wanted to talk about.
There's that's not related to couples, but there is this very common saying that's in the literature that half the jobs that you'll have when you're a grown up haven't been invented yet. So I think that kind of feeling of this very misty future is hard. And I think that people in their 20s can go in different directions, surprisingly.
Great. Yeah, great. Dr. Gilmore, the next question here is along those lines, says, with longer lifespan and less emphasis on picking one career in lieu of possibly having two careers over time, how do you think that impacts this emerging phase?
Well, I think actually there's more than two. People contemplate more than two careers, and I think probably more than a single partner over time. So I think it is, I'm not sure if the emerging adults themselves consciously recognize that because of the example of their parent generation, divorce is quite common. I mean, it's certainly 50% at least. So I think there's a different kind of feeling about the commitment, and career changes, I think, are in part because there are new careers opening up. I think probably they tend to be contiguous with a prior career, but there are new careers opening up all the time.
And I think it what you're describing fits in with Arnett's original theory that there isn't any longer this guarantee that you're going to get a particular job and you're just going to stay there, and you're going to follow this well-worn path, and you kind of know where you're going to be. You're going to get married at a certain age, and you can kind of envision that future for yourself. I think there's much less feeling of pressure to select a career, and much more of a feeling of open possibilities, that I might do this for a while and then do something else. I think it's part of that, that attitude that drives often the older generation nuts, because it can come off as being, irresponsible or not serious or narcissistic, or something along those lines. But I think that's highly characteristic of this age group. It's always very interesting to me, to contrast, those of us who are older clinicians who had to follow a very straight and narrow path. And I mean, this would be true of clinicians who are in their late 20s and 30s as well, right? If you're going to become a social worker, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, I mean, you really do have a path kind of laid out before you. It's long, it's pretty arduous, but you sort of know what you have to do, and what you have to do for a very long time. I mean, becoming a psychoanalyst is like, it just takes literally half a lifetime. To become a child analyst, you sort of know where you're going to be, like, until you're in your 40s for sure, if not later. And I always think it evokes certain feelings, in us when we're working with young people who, are freely talking about, they might do this or they might do that, because the clinicians tend to be people who have followed a certain path, even if you've had a career change, whatever career you were doing, you had to be pretty dedicated to it to get to being a therapist.
Great. Question here, could the change you're describing also be because of parenting differences between Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z? Could it be because of more brain development and social emotional information is more accessible to parents?
Well, there's certainly a lot of accessible information for parents, and parenting has become, a career in itself, and a lot of,
Hmm.
I think, competitive feelings about it, and the usual, but much more present in the society, I think, is very common now. So I think that, I do think that one of these generations, maybe it's millennials, are very interested in self-help and self-discovery. I'm sure that's true of Gen Z to a certain extent. But so I think that being very conscious of what one is doing as a parent is maybe part of that. And actually, I think then they don't want the advice of their parents. They want to consult books and other things that are more up to date.
Great,
It's a
great.
really interesting question and probably understudied. I mean, that would be kind of fascinating to look at. I'm just thinking about the patients that I have who are the parents of emerging adults, and a number of them in high distress, because of the meandering tendencies of their kids. Like, you're sort of waiting for them to, commit to a path or a partner, or so I don't know exactly what it is in their parenting practices that have maybe facilitated that, sense of freedom and exploration, but they don't seem very happy with it for the most part.
Comment here, there's now 30 more questions, so they keep rolling in. So thank you, everybody, for participating. I don't think we'll get to them all, but here you go. This one says, great presentation. How do you conceptualize what might be seen as a kind of a normative identity exploration vis-a-vis developmental concerns such as autism or other neurodivergent individuals?
That's a fascinating question.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one.
You know, there's so many people who are now described as being on the spectrum that I think many of them are following a very similar path, maybe with less flexibility and fluidity. But I think that, I think the attitudes about people on the spectrum have changed a lot too. And so they are really um, moving into very valued careers. I'm not sure what's provided for them, especially. I keep wanting to find oops, sorry. I just lost my screen.
We,
Sorry.
we can hear you, Karen.
Okay. All
Yeah.
right. So I think that there's the loss of some of these workshops for learning how to do a trade. I think some of this is coming back now, but a lot of people who would be very happy being a car mechanic, there's not that much available for them. It's not but more and more there's training for careers like that. And of course, there's a total range of careers for people on the spectrum. Some of them are chairmen of department and things like that. So I think it is very much, I don't know how much is specialized for them. Do you know anything about that, Pamela? No.
No, but I'm thinking that, there probably are modifications to the pathway, right? Because a lot of what we've been talking about involves social exploration. And, I think for a lot of young people on the spectrum, social interaction generates a lot of anxiety, and needs to be conducted in a more structured and calm way. I think, I mean, it's such a, vast, inclusive diagnosis at this point that it's hard to make general statements, but I think a lot of these kids need a little more protectiveness from parents, so that, their experience may be a little bit different. I think it would be really interesting, for somebody to write up even like a couple of case studies, because I think we've all got these kids on the spectrum in treatment, just to try to clarify a little bit more what, what they need, what their experience is like.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question that hasn't really been studied that much, I don't think.
I'm uh, I'm fascinated by the questions as they're rolling in. I'm thinking I'm going to the two of you for your next book, just to write a book on into these questions. So here you go. Um, uh, is the Gen Z stare um, from a lack of soft skills or a result of more screen time or a way to communicate distaste? Or yeah, that's the question.
I guess it depends on which Gen Z is doing it, but I think it's been interpreted as all of that, that they're just listening and they're not saying anything because they are sick of being pushed around by adults who want them to be highly oriented toward accomplishment. But there is this idea that they lack socialization. They haven't worked with, at least for the period of time that COVID was very active in kids' development. And believe me, I think you probably all know that it really had a huge impact on kids in high school. They didn't go to graduation, they couldn't start college. There are a lot of losses that are involved. And I think that maybe it's that to some extent, but probably there's a little bit of a aloofness in it too, which
Mhm.
may have to do with that they know they can get more information from AI than from the expert who's telling them what to do.
I think
Right.
there's I think the aloofness is right. And I think the stare has some interesting defensive properties because the impact it has on other people is a bit intimidating and off-putting, right?
Mhm.
Does not make you feel warm and fuzzy, but I think there's a lot of vulnerability and insecurity underneath it. So
Mhm.
it covers that up very well.
Mhm. Yeah. So what do you think about the increase in, this is a question. What do you think about the increase in estrangement and parental blame in this age group? TikTok seems to encourage self-diagnosis, parental diagnosis, trauma bonding. These kids are still dependent on parents, yet fighting so hard against them, which is really hard for parents.
Yeah, it's about the public forum again because kids were always doing that, criticizing their parents, and particularly in this passage from adolescence to established adulthood, there was a lot of that. But I think it is unfortunately very public, and there's a lot of, it depends on how many parents read these things, but I think it does create a kind of conflict and friction. I'm trying to think if I know any parents who read these TikToks and so on. I'm not sure I do.
Yeah. What are some of the reasons the question says that males seem to generally lag behind females in development across so many areas?
Well, there's a biological reason. They tend to be developmentally slower. I'm not sure why that is, but it's certainly been documented. And so their intellectual capacities take longer to settle in. Their executive function takes longer. They're more prone to action in early childhood, which makes all of these accomplishments that are part of executive function harder in a way. But it is interesting how they then catch up. And because I think girls' experience of puberty is much more challenging in a way, in contemporary culture. So that at that point, I think the boys start to catch up and become the leaders. It's in a very stereotypic way.
And I think from from the sociological literature, there would be additional explanations having to do with going back to the parenting question again, the way that boys are handled differently by their parents, expectations are set differently, they're socialized differently. They're maybe, in some ways, uh, favored or idealized in different ways. So, it would be, it's another question that would be really interesting to see some, current psychological literature on this, right? how in current society, how parenting practices may differentiate between boy and
Mm.
girl children, and what the impact might be.
So here's a great question to put our minds to here. Question, it says, as healthcare professionals, how can we better support emerging adults?
Well, this I think is a really crucial question, and I mean, one response that it comes to mind is this notion of the gap between the mental health needs of this age group and what they're actually getting. I mean, this is like, response for clinicians in particular. And I was very struck in, reading some of the self-report literature, about like trying to figure out why do these young people who have, these soaring rates of depression, anxiety, et cetera, why is it so hard to keep them in a treatment? And, what they say about themselves is that, they value a couple of things that come up again and again. One is the sort of universal finding that they really value a positive relationship with a therapist, that that's one of the most important things. But a close second seems to be this notion of flexibility. And I think that, sometimes that's hard for us because we want to provide a containing frame, and we want to encourage, consistency and commitment and a feeling of responsibility about the treatment. But obviously, what's most important is to sort of, facilitate a young person continuing to calm. So, the flexibility has to do with a little bit of everything. If they want to text you and you prefer to be called, let them text, right? Because that's going to come more naturally. That includes a little, texting, extra session texting, right? Be flexible about the schedule, be flexible about the modality. If a young person wants to use screen and you hate, I'm speaking for myself, you hate doing therapy on screen, you try to accommodate it. Don't expect them to come in, 4 times a week for psychoanalysis. That may not be practical. All of these things. I think just being more accommodating, having more interest in the social and cultural experience. I think all of that is important.
Yeah, and I also think that being open-minded about the path of, for example, as I mentioned, youth cultures are full of drugs, and I think most kids are exposed to a lot of drugs, certainly in New York City. And I think to over emphasize that and to see it as overly as a reigning diagnosis is really wrong. I think you have to see what happens and help them kind of get their sea legs, let's say, in the world of drugs. But I don't think that jumping to any kind of diagnostic conclusion is a good idea unless they're clearly moving into addiction.
Great question here. Some adolescents are having more virtual friends and virtual romantic relationships than in-person friends. What are your thoughts on how to handle this with a patient, or what tools should we be using with them around this?
I mean, I think that might fall under the same category of, trying to be understanding and respectful of the kinds of relationships that people have. I mean, I think a lot of young people consider those online relationships to be real, to be meaningful. It's hard for, I think someone in my generation to feel completely convinced of that, but I know how to be interested and curious,
Right.
So I think it would be a mistake, in the same way, jumping too quickly on, somebody describing their use of drugs at parties or raves. I think you want to try to figure out if this really is getting in the way. I think for sure for some vulnerable kids, it can be a problem. I think for others, the opportunity to have online relationships. I'm thinking about one of the 19-year-old kids who I see, and he's clearly on the spectrum, very well functioning. But in-person social connection is painful for him, and he has online friends. They're deeply meaningful.
Yeah, I mean, I have some patients who have roles online that are really completely not in their life, leadership and negotiating problems in the group, some of these groups that play the games together. I think there's legitimacy to the online. I mean, it's just like Todd Essex said, it's just one continuous mediated space. So I don't think we should be making those distinctions unless, something about it becomes problematic.
Question here. What most young people don't know what they want after completing college, and their response is to say they are bored or sad or anxious. How are they best supported, and what information should be given to them?
Well, I think, these are young people who are being supported by their parents. I mean, because they have to get a job, right? I mean, there is that reality. So I think it may be helpful to support them by saying, you're experimenting now. This is not a final resting place, and encourage them to see it as a process that they're going through in their 20s. Most young people have 7 jobs between 20 and 30. So that's a lot of jobs. And I think I mean, it's not problematic for their future employment and established adulthood. So I think it is really something to kind of soft pedal that they have to make decisions right now. They don't.
And I think that, boredom, which is probably something of a defense, anxiety that, go goes along with, for some young people, with not knowing what the next step is. I think that's part of what's been identified as a pressure for this particular population, that they do have to endure a certain amount of uncertainty, that there isn't a clear path forward. And I think that, can be an essential part of the therapy with this age group, is just sort of, helping them figure out what their interests are and, what they would like to do, and balance that with the reality pressures that they may have, and, sort of, be an active participant in those conversations without, putting our finger on the scale, because, it's also important for us as clinicians not to be overly invested in an outcome.
Mhm.
Great. Probably our last question here. We just have a few minutes left. In working with emerging adults, how do you navigate parent work? Do you embrace their presence or push for independence, or how do you think about that?
Well, I think that's very variable, because if the kid says, I want you to meet my parents, and I don't want to be there, then I do what they say. I think there's something they're telling me about meeting their parents without them present. But some kids don't want you to see their parents at all, and I would also accommodate that. Again, unless there's real health risk or safety issues. I think that you kind of try to take the lead. I think parents who get too involved in emerging adult treatment, it's a problem, because then they're sort of feeling like they're the Uber boss, and then there's you. And they're telling you what they want. So I think kids get very uncomfortable by that.
Here, I'll add one more one more question that's caught my attention here. What psychodynamic features can help distinguish between normative and exploration or moratorium of this phase versus the failure to launch phenomenon?
It's a really good question. I think it's one that comes up all the time, and I don't think there's an easy answer. It's similar to the question of, how do you distinguish between, in a young person, between the onset of identity diffusion and just very active exploration. And I think sometimes you don't know for a few years.
Yes. Right.
Um, right. But there is some expectation that, the young person is at least doing some kind of activity, engaging in some manner of self-discovery, as opposed to just uh sitting at home, right? And
Yeah.
where nothing is going on. I think those are different scenarios. I think more difficult are the more common ones where it's a little bit hard to tell where this is going and if it's going in a direction that's going to lead to greater autonomy. Sometimes you just have to look for the desire for autonomy. If that's not there, I'd be a little concerned.
Right. Great. Thank you both. Thank you, Dr.
Thank
Gilmore.
you.
Thank you.
Very inspiring presentation, and to everybody out there for joining us today and staying with us for this question and answer session. Just as a reminder for everyone wishing to receive continuing education credits, please complete the evaluation survey that will automatically show in the browser as we end the webinar. And we hope you can join us again on October 22nd. And for now, we've been hanging together, as I always say, and now we're going to blip out into our own isolated spaces. And it's a little bit of a jarring experience. So thank you for being here. And that concludes today's Grand Rounds, everybody. Thank you and thanks. Goodbye.